I think we'll have a few people come in, but everyone, this is Dr. Derrick Manici. We're really pleased to have him with us today. Our final seminar for fall 22 semester. Today he's going to share with us a little bit about what he's been doing. Maybe started out as a hobby, but taking his physics and hard science knowledge and doing something fun with it. But it turns out that it's now maybe a business and much more than a hobby. But let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Manici. He is an adjunct professor here at Illinois Tech. He's in the physics department. You may have noticed that in his blurb and hopefully maybe looked him up. But he also spent 20 plus years at Argonne National Lab in a number of different posts. And again, you can read that in his bio. But just from an educational standpoint, he graduated with BS from Cornell University, went to University of Wisconsin in Madison for his master's degree, and then topped it all off with a PhD from Uppsala University. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Manici to tell us about what you've been up to lately. Super excited to hear about Quincy Street Distillery, the craft, the science, and how that folds into just, us historically.
All right, great. Thank you for the introduction, Britt. All right, yeah, so my background is leaving a little bit more eclectic. I also have a history degree from Cornell, and I did a lot of my studies at Wisconsin, even though I was physics and material science. I did it under an analytical chemist, and so I've sort of like learned the panoply of all different techniques for analytical chemistry. So I consider myself a bit of a jack of all trades and Renaissance man, and what better way for that to culminate at the end of my career than making booze? So that's what I'm doing now. And I lived now for like 27 years in this little village, which I'm going to talk about in Riverside. And it's a very interesting place because the place is very historical, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But it's not the natural place you would think to start up a distillery, because it used to be one of these dry towns. So, but I'll explain in a minute why we ended up here. So Quincy Street Distillery, which is named after the street that it's actually located on. And if anybody knows the suburbs of Chicago, they know along the train line, the Aurora train line, they will know that there's many Quincy streets from Chicago all the way out to Aurora along the train line, because it's part of the original Chicago, Burlington, Quincy Railroad. And so there's usually a Burlington Avenue and a Quincy Street along the rail line all over the place. And we're on one of those streets. And it's a craft distillery that's in what was the first commercially planned suburb in the United States, Riverside. And because it's a very historic place, we decided to be about the production of historically inspired spirits. All right. So if you do come to visit us, lovely little place to visit. It's called the Village in the Forest. It's because the entire place was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted in 1869 when it was incorporated to look like an English park. And I'm going to show you the original map from his design. That's the original map of the general plan of Riverside. And you can see it looks like nothing like what the typical suburb or town of the time would have been, which would have been built on grids. It's all curvy like that. It is still like that today. The plat of the village was preserved throughout the history of the village, but it was sort of developed in a funny way. There's a little star there, shows where we are. We're right in the middle of the center of the little tiny downtown of the village. And when it was created, Riverside was meant to be a modern development. It had all these new modern infrastructure and technologies. It had paved roads, and it had raised sidewalks, and it had gas light throughout, and it had a centralized water tower. These were all brand new things. And it was built in this particular location for a couple of reasons. One was because the train line, which had been put in fairly recently, was starting to do commuter service from Chicago. And that meant that if you were a wealthy merchant, you might want to be able to build your summer house or even your regular residence out here and commute back into the city. Or if you wanted, this was also built to be a summer resort with a 19th century resort hotel right by the river, so that you could come out here to enjoy water and enjoy the other things that were in the area. So it was designed to be this idyllic little place. And it would have been that right away, except a few years after they started, there was the Chicago fire and they went bankrupt, and that was the end of that. But on the other hand, they preserved the plat, the original design of the village, and that never changed. So they actually ended up building houses for the next 100 years, slowly filling in all the plots. And the result is, unlike most developed towns, which will have one kind of architecture that's been developed for when it was originally platted, it is a mix of architect from the 1870s all the way to the 1970s, from block to block, house to house. And it's a very unusual looking place as a result, but all in these tree-lined greenery that was meant to look like an English park. But another important geographic feature is that the town sits in the oxbow of the Des Plaines River, which turns out to be not only interesting for the design. He follows the contours of the river and the slopes of the land to the river as part of his design, but also because of the history long before there was Riverside that made this place very important and figures into our story. So we're, as I said, located on 3090 Quincy Street, right in downtown Riverside. And we're sitting in a 1912 arts and crafts industrial building that was originally an auto showroom. This location was known as Auto Alley in the 1910s because there were a lot of auto dealerships in just as the cars are becoming prevalent. And this is one of those buildings. Okay, so a little brief history of how we started out. I was looking at the possibility of starting a winery distillery in Michigan. I originally spent 4 years looking to establish something called Blue Star Distillery there in a place near my summer home in Southwest Michigan. That didn't work out, but along the way, there was an opportunity near my home here in Riverside to consider opening up something similar in Illinois because they changed the law to make it reasonable to do. So we had to completely change the business plan. Instead of being about creating something that was going to utilize fruits and grains that were grown in the agricultural area of Michigan, we decided to be about the historicity of our place and promote the concept and the idea of what our village is as this historical site. So that changed completely what our business plan. In particular, we stopped the idea of being a winery. Northern Illinois is not a good place for wineries. And to emphasize making spirits, specifically things like whiskeys, which were made in the 19th century in Chicagoland and other parts of Illinois. So we were founded in Riverside in 2011. So that means that we are now more than a decade old. When we were set up, we were the 5th craft distiller in the state. There are now over 40 craft distilleries in the state, and that's even with half a dozen having gone out of business in the interim. When we did open up, we were the smallest craft distillery in the state. I don't know that we're the smallest craft distillery in the state now, but we're pretty close to the smallest. What's sort of interesting about that is even though we may be one of the smallest, we actually produce over 25 different spirits, and we actually do much more than you would expect to be done in our small locale. We've been producing those spirits since we first got our still, which was in July of 2012. So that's been over 10 years from now. And we put down our first couple of barrels for making bourbon whiskey in November of 2012. So, exactly a decade ago. And then we did the first bottling of what we call a straight whiskey that had been in Illinois in over 40 years in December of 2014. And the first bottling of what was called a bottled and bond whiskey that had been made over 50 years in the state in May of 2017. So even though we're one of the tiniest distilleries in the state, we're often making some of the oldest whiskeys currently in the state and doing a lot of things which harken back to older historical styles. All right, so before I go on a little bit about what we actually make, I want to give a little general introduction into what's the process for those of you who aren't completely aware. I'm going to talk right now for this example, I'm going to talk specifically about whiskeys. Whiskeys are made from grains, only grains, although they can be malted. And we are what they call a grain to glass distillery. That means we actually start off with the grain or malts and then go all the way then to the production of the finished product. Everything is handcrafted, and artisanal. We use all our own formulations, although that's often historically inspired. We are doing what's called fermentation on grain after mashing. If anyone's familiar with how beer is made, because essentially what you make whiskey from is distillation of a beer. The beers that you make that you drink, you end up fermenting from something called a wort, which is after you've extracted all of the components out of the grain. But in the case of most American whiskeys, you ferment on grain. That means you make up a beer that is leaving the grain and the yeast and everything in the beer until you go to distill it. Everything goes into the still for distillation. So you're distilling on grain after fermentation. Then when you do the distillation, it's very important that the distiller has to make what are called make the cuts, which is separating what we call hearts, or the part of the run from the still that we want to keep for the whiskey, from the heads, the beginning stuff, and the tails. And that's done traditionally by taste, nose, and artisan's judgment. Although there's lots of places where one could try to understand how you could use scientific measurements in order to control or improve that. One of the reasons why it's still often done that way, that is by nose, is because our nose is an unbelievably sensitive and discerning instrument. It turns out you have to use pretty sophisticated techniques analytically in the laboratory if you actually want to do better than the nose does. But the nose can tell you what you're doing is good or bad, but it does not necessarily tell you why. And in the end, everything is hand bottled and labeled. As I said, because we're a local artisanal distillery, we actually sell things here right at the distillery. We sell our finished bottled product. We even have a little cocktail bar or speakeasy in the front of the distillery. I'm actually sitting in there now, if you can sort of see in the background. The bar is behind me. And we also distribute our products. In Illinois, we distribute by a company called H2V Number. We are in a few other states. All right, so that gives you an overall picture of what we do. We bring in grain, raw materials, we ferment them into a beer or some other, or a wash. We distill them, and then we bottle them, and then we sell them. We do the whole thing. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you our still. And this is, we call it TikTok after the Copper Robot and Wizard of Oz, because, you know, we name our stills and I like the Wizard of Oz. And it's a 60-gallon copper pot still, which is custom built for us by a place called Vendome Copper and Brass out in Louisville, Kentucky. This company's been around for over 100 years. They are the oldest and largest manufacturer of whiskey stills in the US. And while what they do is their main business is build components for the giant tower stills that are used industrially to make things like whiskey or even general distillation today, they still have the original 100-year-old wooden workshop where they manufacture copper pot stills like this. And you should be familiar with the stills of the industrial type, because there's one a stone's throw away from the departments and the FDA's research labs out there in Summit, right? It's, you know, there's that giant industrial corn ethanol still there. And that's actually what most whiskey is made in as well, those kind of giant tower stills. This kind of still was the type that was typical for production in the earlier parts of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, pretty much everybody has gone, because of economics, to the use of the giant tower stills. And that's how 95% of all the whiskey is made today. In fact, even today, if I want to have one of these copper pot stills, ours as 60 gallons, very small. They typically tend to be more like 300, 400, 500, 600 gallons today. But this size would have been similar to the size of a typical farmer's still anywhere in the Corn Belt in the early part of the 19th century. Imagine if you were a corn farmer in the 19th century and you have a bumper crop of corn. You have a problem, because it turns out corn doesn't store very well. Silos were invented to deal with that, but that's a later 19th century invention. Other grains don't tend to have as much difficulty with this. They'll store better. And so rather than lose the corn, you want to have a way to capture its value. And the most common way to capture that value would have been by turning it into whiskey, by fermenting and distilling it. And so there were lots of farm distillers throughout the Corn Belt, some legal, some illegal. And not every farmer did this, but maybe all your neighbors would bring over their corn if there were bumper crop of corn, and you would distill it for them. Now, typically these would have been wood-fired stills. We don't do that today because alcoholic vapor is explosive. It's a good way to basically blow up your building. So ours is electrically fired with a main marie instead of wood fired, but otherwise very typical of the size that would have been used all the way back into the 18th century. In fact, this company, Vendome Copper and Brass, had been built the replica still for Mount Vernon for the distillery that George Washington had when at the end of his life. These stills can be used without plates, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In the cylinder or column that's on top, that's then called a pot still, or it can have some plates in the column that are on top, and these are called the hybrid pot still or a column pot still. Currently, we use this still for the stripping and final distillation for all of our products except one, which is vodka. Okay, so with that, I'm going to stop the share for a second and talk a little bit more about the process, but I'm going to do it while showing you the distillery. I'm going to walk out, see if this works. And I don't know what I need to do to make me show up as instead of as the active agent. Am I the central screen up there?
You are.
Okay.
We see everything behind you. So
great. Great. So I've never done this way. We'll see how this works out. It's like doing a giant selfie. Okay, so you can see the distillery is right behind me. Just behind those doors went from the bar in the front to a very small location in the back. This is our production area. We are small, so it is very crowded. And if we come back here, we're going to come back and you can actually see that same still that you saw in the view graph. It's right there. TikTok is right there. It's not the only still that we have. We do have another still. That other still is located in the same space over here. Whereas the other still is built to my specification. This still, which is all stainless and very tall, this one I built up after my own design and by purchasing parts. The fun part of being an instrumental scientist is that you can go ahead and build these things in your sleep. So this is called the Tin Man, of course, and this is our vodka still. And the main difference is that, well, first of all, it's got a glass column, which is really great. I like to use it for teaching because you can actually watch the process occurring. But it has many plates, and as a result, does very high rectification, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute, and gets you to very high purity ethanol, because that is the definition of vodka. Essentially, you make pure ethanol, something over 190 proof, and then you dilute it with water and then filter with charcoal, and then that's vodka. So it's not really very interesting from a distiller's point of view. In our case, we use the vodka is made from the waste products of making our whiskey. So it's economical, but it's also delicious. You'll notice that I walked by some big plastic containers. Now, traditionally in the 19th century, they would be using wooden vats, but they would be maybe about this size or larger. And this is actually open fermentation when we ferment in these. So we basically make up the beer in something called a mash tun, which is that steel tank there, and we just mix it all up and heat it up with all the grain and water. And the key is that we have to convert all the starches to sugar, and we do that by adding enzyme. And the traditional way of adding enzyme would be to add a small amount of malt, because malted grains have enzyme in it. That's what the point of malting is. And so particularly if I'm making bourbon, which is one of the things we make, it's mostly corn, about 84%, and then we add about 9% barley malt, 7% rye malt, and we add them so that we can do the conversion of all the starches to sugar. And once we've done all the starches to sugar conversion, we have to crash what we call the mash. We have to crash it, which means drop the temperature down low enough so that we can add yeast, because higher temperatures kill yeast. And we do it fast because it turns out temperatures in between good temperatures for bacteria to grow, and we don't really want to start to spoil the beer before we actually get the alcohol being produced. Once the alcohol starts to be produced by the yeast, it'll inhibit most of the bacterial growth. So we crash the mash, pump it over into one of these plastic fermenters, and pitch the yeast. And the process I'm describing is very similar to the way the process would have been done in the early 19th century. In fact, as a scientist, I'm always surprised how consistent the product is that you can make from batch to batch, year in, year out, using such primitive methods. It is really quite surprising. And we actually do some measurements to actually monitor things because, well, I'm a scientist. but also because if things go awry, one way to know, something's wrong is checking to see if the process has done things the way you expected them to do. It's surprising to me, with very primitive capabilities, you can actually do things very consistently, especially when you consider any change in the process changes the outcoming product. You change the temperature, you change the yeast, you change the particular source of grain, you change anything and the flavor profile changes. You get a different product, but keep everything the same, and you can surprisingly make the same product day in and day out. But of course, in some ways, it had to have been that way. So it wasn't that way, we couldn't have been making whiskeys for hundreds of years the way we have, because they didn't have all the fancy techniques we have today. So we do the fermentation in these plastic containers instead of instead of doing wood. It is considered open fermentation and only takes about 5 days to a week. Very fast fermentation. You get a beer, which is about 13% ethanol, and that's what you distill. And we'll just pump it over into the still and distill it. So that's the process, right? You make a mash, which is a slurry of the grains. You add something to convert enzymes to convert everything into sugar. You then just let it ferment by pitching yeast and letting go to the highest alcohol you can get. Pump it over into the still, fire it up, and distill it. Okay, so rather than talk about a lot of the fermentation part, the part I decided I'm going to concentrate talking a little bit more about today is going to be the distillation part. So let me do that. I'm going to go back to sharing. Okay, so everybody see that again? Okay.
Yep.
So I'm going to just a little more detail on what these stills are like. Here's a schematic of a pot still with a bain-marie. That's the surrounding vessel that indirectly heats it. So it does indirect heating by a water bath that surrounds the copper pot. That's exactly how we work it. And then we do the heating of that water bath itself electrically in our case. But it can be any heat source. You have some sort of agitation, so you can prevent caking or settling of contents that are being distilled. And you have manways for access to the contents and some sort of pipe and valve to empty the contents out. And the picture here is an example of what we call an alembic style helmet over the pot. In my case, I had a simple cylinder with what's called an onion or ogee. But there can be many other kinds of shapes. That can include cylinders and cones and ogees and onions, etc. But this is a alembic style helmet, for example. Why all the different shapes? Well, because the slightly different shapes all provide slightly different effects in terms of recondensing or refluxing whatever is being boiled off out of the beer. And then this still connects to something that's called a line arm, which is simply a pipe to connect the top of the still, head of the still, to a condenser. And in this particular case, the example they show here, and it's the same as what I have in my still, is something called a tube and shell or shotgun condenser. It is a device that has a bunch of small, narrow stainless steel pipes running up and down that carry cold water in them, so that the vapor will condense on the pipes, and then as it trickles down, it will cool off. And it's very important that we get it coming out of the still relatively cold, because if it comes out hot, we're going to lose the alcohol we spent all the time, but through evaporation. I'm also going to show you a schematic of a pot still with a column on top. And in my particular still, that cylinder, that column on top, I can actually put a set of what we call plates into it with a deflegmator on top, or take them out. So I can run it in the two different modes. That was one of the custom design features of my still, because you get different flavor profiles and different results by using the different kinds of stills. Again, this has indirect heating of the water bath. In this case, the alembic helmet's been replaced with a cylinder to provide the rectification. And inside the cylinder, or when we do this, we call it a column, it contains plates that control the vapor flow. And each plate allows local condensation of the vapor into a pool by reflux. The pools all have similar alcohol concentration as any of the vapor coming up from beneath that plate. And then over time, as more vapor vents through, the pools will eventually start to boil. But when they boil, they'll create a vapor with a higher percentage of alcohol. And that will rise up through to the next plate. And then you get reflux and you form another pool. And that pool will have a higher percentage of alcohol than the plate underneath. And eventually that pool will boil and it'll rise up and make a pool on the one above. And you get the idea. What's amazing is how well that can work once you get to equilibrium. I showed you that vodka still that has 16 plates in it, which is what you need to get over 190 proof. And that process will work, and you'll eventually end up with every plate having a pool, every pool boiling, each one pushing up vapor to the one above, every pool having a higher percentage of alcohol than the one beneath. So the way to think about it is, as you go up the plates, you have higher and higher percentage of alcohol. By the way, as you go down the plates, the temperature is actually going up. And the reason is because as you have less alcohol and more water for that mixture, the higher the percentage of water, the higher the temperature it's going to boil at. All right, and that's typically how columns work. And that's true for all kinds of stills for two-component distillation. Okay, the result will then result in higher concentration on the successive plates. And basically, the more plates you have, the higher the percentage of alcohol you can get out of the still to some degree. And that's why the little copper still has only 4 plates, and it's not meant to get the very high proof. And the big, the tall vodka stills has 16 plates, and it's meant to get to as close to the azeotrope, which is around 196 proof. Okay. So in the case of whiskey, I just described everything you need to do. You make the beer, you ferment by making a mash, ferment it. Once it's fermented, you pump it over in the still, you run the still, and then you're going to get product out as you continue to run the still. Now, the thing to think about is that the product coming out over time can't be the same. It has to be changing, because in the beginning, you're going to be boiling off as much reasonable amount of alcohol. In fact, in our still, and if I'm have the beer in there, initially I'll come out at about 60% or 120 proof. And then as I continue to run the still, there's less and less alcohol remaining in the pot. And therefore the proof coming out of the pot continues to drop. In fact, if you think about it, when I'm all done with the distillation, that means I've used up all the alcohol in the pot. And that means I have to be just boiling water. So the only thing coming out is water. So from the beginning, we're going to start out with lots of alcohol. Over time, the alcohol level continues to drop. And at the end, all we will be getting is water. And that's a very important part of how this kind of still operates in order to determine flavor profile, which I'll mention in a second. Okay, so if I just take that, what we call new make or the spirit that just comes off the still that way, using our corn mash, for example, this was what our first product was, which we call Water Tower White Lightning, named after our landmark water tower. It's technically an unaged corn whiskey. It's what we would call the original farmer's whiskey in the Corn Belt, because they generally didn't age the product. By law, it has to be 80% or more corn. Ours is 83 to 84% corn, 9% barley malt, and 7 to 8% rye malt. That's our mash bill. Fermented on grain, distilled on grain after fermentation. And we're doing pot distillation, no plates. And traditionally that's done with 2 distillations. The first is called the strip, because you're literally stripping the alcohol out of the beer. The resulting product is called low wines. Usually it's about 100 proof in total, and you collect maybe about 10 gallons of it for each distillation. And then once you've accumulated about 30 gallons of that, you'll distill it a second time. That's called the spirit run. And that's where we're going to determine the final flavor profile. It's a funny name. Our water tower today is not exactly the same water tower. It burned down like a torch on New Year's Eve, 1912, 1913. And so that's what it's a pretty funny name. Okay. So what you have now is what we call white whiskey. And of course, most whiskeys, however, aren't white. They usually are brown, and they are missing flavors and aromas when they come off the still that we associate with whiskey. So the second part of making a product like whiskey is specifically aging the product in cask. So that's just as important for making whiskey. There are lots of white spirits where aging is not done, so it's not required. Things like vodka, rum, etc. But most people expect to have aged whiskeys. So let me talk a little bit about what happens when we're doing that. What's the point of what we call maturation in cask? What are its objectives? First, it's going to do a controlled and slow oxidation of the spirit over time. And this is to basically create more interesting flavor compounds, as well as to maybe eliminate some compounds not only don't taste good, but maybe not be as healthy. But you're also going to get extraction of things from basically oak phenols and other compounds that will impart flavor and texture from the wood itself. And you're also going to get evaporation of water and alcohol through the wood, which increases the extract concentration. And so I have a little figure there that shows all the things that are coming out of the oak heartwood. Oak's the only thing you can use by law for whiskey in the United States, but it's really the only wood that really works. Cedar might. That's because most woods either rot in the presence of the water, or they won't swell properly. Oak and cedar do this, but cedar is going to give you a flavor you're not going to necessarily want. Oak gives you the flavors you want. And we get all kinds of extractives, and some of those extractives are going to be desirable as they are, some won't be. So you don't necessarily want to drink the product soon after it comes in contact with the oak. This is typically the type of barrels that are used, the oak barrels that are used even today. The same thing would have been used 100, 200 years ago. And the key feature for the barrels used for American whiskeys is that not only do we put the barrel together with the oak and maybe toast the oak on the inside, which the Europeans do generally as well. This is also done for wine, but for American whiskeys, the oak is charred. And that's actually a legal requirement. And that wasn't always the case, but it was always the case for one specific whiskey, which is bourbon. That's what defined what bourbon was when it was first made in Virginia before they moved into Kentucky territory. It was a whiskey made from corn and transported, because they really didn't age it very long, in charred oak barrels. Why did they do that? We don't really know. But we think they learned the practice from observing that cognac barrels had char, and that's what the French fur traders brought with them, which is also where we think the name bourbon comes from, is from the French fur traders. That was the name of the region where it was first being made. Eventually, those guys all go to Kentucky. So we char in these oak barrels, which we char these oak barrels in order to get a combination of toast between the raw wood and then char in direct contact. And this is sort of a picture of that. The first thing we have to think about is going to happen is extraction. We're going to extract flavors out of, some things will come out of the char itself. Most of the things will come out of the underlying toasted wood and travel through it. There's a lot of different chemical compounds that are being extracted, all the way from very small, simple compounds like small phenols and simple secondary alcohols and things, to more larger ones, to actual polymers, polysaccharides. Most of these are actually in part degradation products of things like the lignin and the cellulose, et cetera, over time. The second thing after extraction that happens is what we call aging, right? So aging is only one of the things happening in maturation in the cask. And this is basically all the slow chemical reactions that are happening over time between the alcohol, the water, the congeners, that is the other small chemical molecules that came across in the still that gave us the flavor in the unaged product, and the extractives from the wood. These will sit and react very slowly over time. Some people talk about fast aging. There is no such thing really. You can effectively slow aging down by cooling the whiskey, but that slows down all the reactions, of course, not equally, which is something to consider. But if you want to speed it up, you could theoretically heat the whiskey, but eventually it's going to cause you to cook it. So you don't really do that. Most people talk about fast aging really mean fast extraction. There are many ways to do that. One's to use a smaller barrel. The main thing that happens is that some of the larger molecules will break down to smaller, some of the polymers, and some of the smaller molecules will react to form larger, more complex ones. Particularly, one of the most important things that goes on is something called esterification, and produces a lot of the interesting flavor profile that are found in longer aged products. And then the last thing we have to consider in maturation in cask is transpiration. And Transpiration means the whiskey can go into the wood, it can come back out of the wood, it can evaporate through the wood. If the whiskey goes into the wood, gets stuck in there when we empty that, we call that the devil's cut. That's a few percent. But more importantly, the whiskey goes through the wood and disappears. That's called the angel share loss. And that's an appreciable loss. It depends upon the barrel type, depends upon temperature and humidity. This figure shows it's something being on the order of maybe 3% per year. That's probably true if you're in a large standard American whiskey barrel today of 53 gallons. You go down, and that means you can end up losing, half the volume in about 10 years. But if you're in a tiny little barrel, like a 10-gallon, you can lose half the volume in just 2 or 3 years. So it's an appreciable loss. You might think that's simply a bad thing, that you're losing whiskey. Why would you want to do that? But it's important that that actually happens. And the part of the reason is because one of the effects of aging is that you get more complex and interesting flavors, but the extractions don't continue forever. Eventually you stop extracting flavor from the wood, and then the flavors, as they continue to age, tend to get softer and lighter. And if the whiskey were just left in a sealed container like that, you might expect it to get very weak in flavor. But what happens is, because some of the ethanol and water evaporates through the wood, but it leaves the flavor components behind, you reconcentrate those flavors. And so the whiskey can actually get more flavor over time by this process. Although most of the whiskey makers try to keep it balanced so that the amount that's being extracted and the amount that's being reconcentrated is sort of balanced by the time you finish your product. Okay, so that's this. If somebody asks, well, what contributes the most to flavor? For us doing aged whiskeys, we typically say it's roughly a 50-50 proposition, although it depends upon the specific product, that half the flavors derive from what you made by fermentation and distillation, the flavors that are in that actual new make, and half of it's what you derive by later maturing in cask. And in fact, for the oldest whiskeys, you're going to get domination of cask effects. For younger whiskeys, you may not get as much of an effect from the cask, but there's also a difference in how you make it. Modern whiskeys made in the giant tower stills actually tend to have lower congeners, tend to be a lighter quality spirit going into the barrel, and there's more of the emphasis of the flavors coming from the barrel. The early 19th century whiskeys made in the pot still actually allow more congeners, more of the flavor components to come across. These are all the other molecules that aren't water and ethanol, and those products are more likely to basically dominate in flavor. And that's actually a choice we made, to make pot distilled whiskeys the way they made in the early 19th century, because we specifically wanted to have the highest quality amount of grain flavor in the final distillate, because that's what we think those early whiskeys were like. So one of the first products we came out with was something we call Bourbon Spring, which is our young rested Illinois bourbon whiskey. Its mash bill was the same as the mash bill of the new make. It's predominantly corn with a little bit of barley and rye malt. Made the same way. There's actually no difference between the whiskeys. It's the same juice, as we like to say. We aged it in very small charred oak barrels, about 10 gallons, and it's typically only aged for about 3 to 5 months. We call this sometimes our baby bourbon. But because the barrels are so small and have such a large surface area compared to the 53 gallons that are used today in a modern distillery, they can extract all the flavor and color you want in that short period of time. In fact, if you leave it in there for 6 to 9 months, it'll probably over oak and not be drinkable. We think that the bourbons of the early 19th century were made this way. First of all, they weren't using the large barrels because they would have to ship the barrels, since there was no bottling until well after the Civil War, directly to the tavern owners in very small barrels. And they were described in the early 19th century as having a ruby color and smoky flavor from the char in the barrel, because bourbon was the first whiskeys that were using these charred barrels. And that char would come about from aging, but most of the aging was simply in transport or briefly in a warehouse or sitting on the back bar of the tavern. And they didn't want to let it sit in there for very long, because if it sat there for long, it could either over oak or you get angel share loss, and they would be having less product to sell. So they describe these as having these particular characteristics. The bourbon we make this way has these characteristics. And it is a different product than the product today. And yet the product that gave bourbon its original reputation in the 19th century is not the product we drink today. It's this product. It was something that had this intense color and flavor from the exposure of so much charred oak and such a small barrel. And it was very grain intense in flavor because it hadn't been aged for very long. This is still our most popular bourbon. It's the one that wins us gold medals. And that's because, and it's one that if I didn't tell you was only 4 months old, people think it's 3, 4, 5 years old. You can't really understand it without tasting it. But we think it's essentially a piece of history. Now, the name Bourbon Spring is not a random name. It's actually a historic site that's about 1,000 yards from the distillery. It's named after the spring located nearby. It was where the Cook County Militia was formed in 1834. And that was because they ended up celebrating with a barrel of punch cooled in the spring, a bourbon barrel. And then the name comes from that. There's a bronze marker that identifies that. It's part of the early history of Illinois. Long before there was a riverside, this oxbow of the Des Plaines River was very important. It was the center of the fur trade before the state existed. It was the center of the fur trade back when the French fur traders first came here in the 18th century. And that's because the oxbow of the Des Plaines is very shallow, has many fords, and all the Indian trails and later country roads crisscross through this point. And as a result, the first trading town in the area was formed. It was called Lyon, after the French city, but we call it Lyons today. It's the same place. And the French fur traders remained there until the Louisiana Purchase. One of the reasons why they came here was specifically because about a mile south from here is the portage, which LaSalle had discovered was the way the east and west river systems connected for moving goods. And so everything made this the place to be for the fur trade industry in the 19th century. It turned out after the Americans started moving in, taking over the trading industry to fur traders from Michigan, the Lawton brothers established a trading post just a couple more miles south. And then they set up their homestead near the town here, and it became the most popular tavern in the 1820s and 30s, Lawton Tavern. In 1832 and 1834, there were some Indian wars, which required establishment of a militia after the Indian wars were over. And so the local first sheriff of Cook County, Steve Forbes, calls a meeting together at the Lawton Tavern to form a militia. And because the men, 1,000 of them, get together and are at a tavern, they want to drink. So they make a punch in a bourbon barrel and put it into the nearby spring to keep it cold. And thereafter, it's called Bourbon Spring. So that's where our name comes from. And it's our nod to this early history and this early style of bourbon. But we do make many other whiskeys. We make something that's more like late 19th century whiskeys. By the late 19th century, they're bottling. 1870s, 1880s, they're going from 30 to 40 to eventually the 47-gallon barrel. So we make the same exact whiskey, but age it in the larger barrels, 53 gallons, and we age it for 2 or more years, because the larger the barrel, the less extractive you get over a fixed amount of time, and you need to be in the barrel longer to get all the wood extractives. So we do a 2-year-old, what's called a straight bourbon whiskey, a 3-year-old whiskey, a 4-year-old whiskey, and the 4-year-old is actually what we call a bottled in bond. So this whiskey's bottled slightly higher proof, but it's still the same whiskey. And it's just named after the 2 fur traders who had that tavern. We also make another very interesting historic style of whiskey called North American Steamship Rye. This is our signature all malt rye whiskey. Malt rye whiskey is not the same as a rye whiskey. Rye whiskey is made from unmalted rye. Malt rye whiskey is made from malted rye. It has a different flavor profile. The majors don't make it because malt rye is so much more expensive than rye, but this was what we think was the earliest colonial whiskey made in the Americas, both in Virginia and New York. They actually wanted to make what we call Scotch today, or malt whiskey, but they couldn't grow barley malt in the eastern seaboard. It got attacked by ergot, a fungus. And so they made it from what they could easily grow, which was rye, but they made it the same way, which meant they malted all the rye and made whiskey from it. It took them another 50 years to figure out they didn't have to malt rye, so eventually they stopped doing that. But it gives you a different flavor profile. Traditionally, it's made in a pot still. Ours is named after one of the early passenger steamships on Lake Michigan, the SS North American. And when we made it, we came out with what was the first crafted bottle and bond in over 50 years in the state. We make probably one of the best versions of this style of whiskey in the country, but it's made only by a handful of small distilleries. Well, we don't do just whiskey. We did other things. Another one of our second product actually was a gin, but it was an unusual gin, not a dry gin, an American style, which was made right off of bourbon mash, inspired by an 1819 recipe we found. They literally would just basically making corn liquor with juniper and botanicals in it. And the result is something that they sometimes refer to as a railroad gin. So we make that product as well. And we sometimes make products actually don't have a historical basis, but they're simply sort of interesting to us for various reasons. I'm not going to go to all our products. We make 25 different kinds of spirits, but this one's sort of interesting in particular because it's going to lead into talking a little bit about some of the science that we're doing, which is a honey spirit. We call this Prairie Sunshine. So what is a honey spirit? Honey spirit does not mean a spirit where I add honey, like buying honey flavored whiskey. It means a spirit made from the distillation or product from honey. In other words, you make mead, which is honey wine, and distill it. We do this from local honeys that we get in the area. The result is something that's akin to a white rum or agave spirit, but with a honey-like nose that is reminiscent of mead, if you're familiar with mead as a product. Every batch can be different if you have different honey sources. In fact, it very much reflects the specifics of the honey, which is one of the interesting things about it. And you would use it like you would use a rum. This style of spirit is very rarely made. In fact, I think we were one of the first ones to make it in the US because honey is one of the most expensive sources of sugar you can use. And everything is about keeping costs controlled. Although now there's about 7 or 8 distillers that make honey spirit in the country, of which 4 are my former interns. So that gives you sort of an insight, the idea of the impact a small business can sometimes have. Recently, we got funded by the National Honey Board to specifically study the congeners. That means the trace organics that give the flavor and aroma that are found in honey spirit distilled from mead. And why they're interested is because they're interested in promoting honey product and understanding how the choice of honey affected the spirit. And while there has been lots of studies of the congeners, the traces of organic materials that give flavor to different spirits, not for honey spirit, because none of the majors made it. And so, did not look into it at all, although some people looked at mead. So what do I mean when I talk about congeners? This is where we're going to talk a little bit about some of the science. So the congeners are basically everything that is in there that's not alcohol and water. In fact, we think the term comes from the old Scots and that it means basically everything we don't know what it is. Although today we have a pretty good idea what everything is because we've studied it all. Here's sort of just an example of the rough makeup of all the different congeners that you can find in alcoholic products of different types. And you can see it's all over the place. Depending upon what your source material was and even how you make it, you're going to get completely different congeners in the final distillate. But they're giving you the flavors and aromas and also the toxicity. You notice in a lot of, especially the fruit-based products, the largest congener is actually methanol. That's part of the stuff you want to make sure you get rid of because it is poisonous. So understanding the congeners is important to both know how the product is going to taste and smell, but also to make sure the product is safe. And how do you determine what the congeners are? Other than just smelling it, which, is a pretty good analytical tool. The best tool we have is gas chromatography. So here's an example of the typical high value congeners you'll find in most spirits using conventional gas chromatography. And you can see that in addition to the ethanol itself, you're going to get methanol and acetone and aldehydes. These come off very early in the distillation. We often call these the 4 shots. Later on, you're going to get heavier objects, things like ethyl acetate formates. You're going to get other ketones. You're going to get higher level alcohols. This part's often called the heads. And then you get heavier and heavier molecules, although in less and less quantity over time. And that's usually called the hearts. That's the part you want to keep. And then in the tails, you get very, very heavy things, including oils, fusel oils. So studying these is probably one of the most important things you can do if you want to understand what is going on with your product. The problem is that from toxicity point of view, measuring these items is a relatively straightforward thing to do. Simple, inexpensive gas chromatography will allow you to assay and study the presence of ethanol and other light alcohols and acetone, ketones, et cetera, methanol. But most of that stuff you're going to throw away. You're going to get rid of in the cuts. So it turns out they're not really showing what the flavor is. The flavor is in the noise in this graph. That's the interesting thing. And so if you're really going to actually study, I'll come back, you're going to study this, gas chromatography, conventional gas chromatography is not sensitive enough. You have to use GCMS. You have to do gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy, sensitive detection, and usually pretty decent spectrometers. And why that's a difficulty is that that's usually not something that's very readily accessible to small distilleries. And if they can get access to a lab that does it, it's usually pretty expensive. And we're doing some of that ourselves. We've been doing some of it at different universities. It's hard to do. It's one of the things I think could really be a great boon to the craft distilling industry is if specifically GCMS became available in some more affordable manner. Of course, part of the cost of doing this is the machines themselves, but the reality is they're not that expensive anymore. That you can amortize that cost out. The real cost is the people to operate and then interpret spectra. So that's something we're looking at. We're looking at it specifically with regards to trying to understand our Prairie Sunshine, that is the distillate from mead. And the main question we were asking was, okay, if you look at the gas chromatography of mead, you're going to see production of certain congeners in the wine. You distill it, they will change, some will come across and some will be changed by the distillation process. And one of the questions becomes, what's the relationship between the source material in the honey, what you actually get in the mead, and then what you get in the final distillate. And we're just beginning that work right now. But the hard part is that it's hard to actually get the low concentration elements in the mead itself. In fact, the ironic thing is the only paper I ever found published about that, they reconcentrated the sample to get that measurement made by distilling it, not realizing that in the process of doing that, they don't have the same product anymore. In the distillate, it's more concentrated, but you're going to have to use a much more sensitive method than regular gas chromatography. You have to do something like mass spec detection, even double mass spec detection. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've run out of time, but also that's what I actually plan to discuss, and then open it up to maybe just general questioning, either about what we're doing as a distillery or what we could be doing if we want to do more scientific study in a small distillery.
Oh, we have two. Oh, well, Dr. Manici, this was fabulous. In fact, I have a room full here. We were watching you on a much bigger screen, so we love the tour. And also the students asked, okay, so is there like a whiskey tasting under one of these chairs or?
No, but we'd like to organize something for you.
I've talked about doing a tour, right?
Absolutely. Because then you can use
all right,
sensitivity to measure it.
Let me open it up for questions. This was, and I did fail to say that this is a class. So for all the students, you got your American history, you got you got a lot of chemistry today. You even got some microbiology. I mean, it was filled with just pretty much everything in food science, right? And nutrition. There were some phytochemical polyphenols in there.
Oh, yeah.
Which are bioactives that we love. Okay, so let me open it up. Any questions?
Yeah, and I'm willing to stay a little longer if you guys want me to talk, but go ahead.
Okay, we'll have to manage because we have a couple different devices in this room. Oh, Baisad, please go ahead.
Hi, Derek. Very nice meeting you. It's great to have you here. A wonderful presentation. As Britt said, real Renaissance man talk, I think. It was great. I really enjoyed it. And I live in Riverside. I completely agree with you about everything you said about the Riverside. It's
lovely place.
Fantastic.
Have you visited us?
I have actually, and I had the privilege of trying some of the drinks that people served there before the pandemic. I think after the pandemic, it was closed, and I don't know if you opened it. I haven't been there for.
Yeah, we are open. We survived the pandemic solely because of PPP money, and we're slowly coming back. So yeah, it was a challenge. But
I really enjoyed it. I had a question about yeast. I don't know how much is known about the final contribution of different types of yeast to the taste and aroma.
Yeah, it's very well studied, actually, but of course, you have to study it again every time you do a different spirit. Yeast are a big component of the final flavor profile. You change the yeast, you change the flavor of the product. Now, for whiskeys, for example, you're using beer yeast, right? Because you're making a beer, generally using beer yeast. And yet, even there are hundreds of varieties of beer yeast. People know this if they drink beers because every beer tastes different by virtue of the yeast that's chosen for it in part, as well as the mash bill. The same thing is true for whiskeys. So for each of my different whiskeys, I use a different version of yeast. But then you have different yeast for different kind of products. For example, we make a rum. We make a Jamaican style rum. To get a Jamaican style rum, I need a Jamaican yeast to make it work properly. Not only that, in a gross sense, I have to have a different yeast because it has to be a yeast that wants to eat the byproducts of molasses rather than the byproducts of conversion of grain. But also it has to ferment at higher temperature because it's meant to ferment in the tropics, and it gives you completely different congeners as a result. So if you want this classic hodo or funkiness that you get from a Jamaican rum, you have to use a Jamaican yeast. I mean, it matters. Use a different yeast, you get a different product. Of course, back in the 19th century, they didn't really understand all this. What would happen is you'd often be using the wild yeast to begin with, and then locally, what happens is your yeast infect your distillery over time. And then if you're making good stuff, it's because that yeast is working for you. Today, those modern distilleries have labs that culture the same monoclonal yeasts that they've had that go back historically to what the wild yeast was that took residence in their distilleries, because they don't leave it to chance anymore. But that's true, that everything is growing. It makes a big difference. For example, one of the things I'm supposed to be studying in my congener study for the honey spirit is looking what happens if we change the yeast. It turns out honey spirit is extremely sensitive to the choice of yeast in its final flavor profile. If you're a mead maker, you know this. Most people who are hobbyists may not know this. Everybody goes out and uses like champagne yeast to make mead. Don't do that. That makes very bad mead. Everything is about the choice of the yeast. And so, yeah, it can be, sometimes yeast choice can be more than half the flavor profile. Sometimes it's maybe not as important. So yes, yeast matter. Everything.
Sorry, Derrick, has anybody looked at the genomics of these yeast?
Oh yeah.
This is one of the projects, we had in.
Yeah, they are. I mean, the beautiful thing about yeast, right? It's a very nice thing to study, right? You can control it, read it fast. You can, it's great stuff. Yeah, there's a lot, but most of what's studied is what gets funded by the large distilleries, right? And some of it doesn't get, some of it's kept trade secret, but a lot of it that is published, it's being funded by the big distilleries, the big wineries, the big breweries. So what is made by the big companies is well understood for the most part. But if you're doing something in a niche, there's opportunities if you want to collaborate with academics to do some interesting things that nobody else will do because the majors aren't going to look at it, but might be fun for some other reason. And particularly if you're interested in sort of doing a paleo yeast genealogy, right? And trying to understand what the past was like. And that would be one of the interesting things to do, because you have to play with the yeast, but sometimes the only way to connect to the past is to know the process they use, reproduce the process, compare it to what they describe the product as being like, because we have no extant product. It's that's fun to do. I mean, that's the kind of stuff, like if I could do that straight through the rest of my second career, I would love to do stuff like that.
Thank you.
Hi, Derrick. Good question. Hi. I have to admit, this is the most interesting seminar we had in this semester. We had a virtual tour of the facility. That's so interesting. I teach food microbiology, and part of the lectures is about wine brewing and beer brewing and dairy product fermentation. So this is kind of a very interesting talk to me. Just a couple of quick questions. How often or how did you do a kind of a full cleanup after your fermentation cycle? Are you gonna shut down everything?
Good question. Every fermentation we do a sterilization of the fermenters. Okay, that's a good practice, because we are doing it the way they did it in the early 19th century, which means we are not doing closed fermentation. Everything's fairly open. That means you're getting exposed to wild products. You're getting exposed to other funguses and molds and bacteria. And so the whole key is you have to give the yeast, like a home brewer would do, you have to give the yeast every opportunity to have a competitive advantage against everything that might contaminate it. Now, you can sometimes get contaminants in a distillery that are aggressive and that are dangerous or problematic. And then the only way to fix that is you're going to have to shut down the distillery and clean the whole place up. Luckily, that doesn't happen a lot. And you live with certain competition. I didn't mention it, but one of the things we do when we make our corn spirit, our corn beer, is we let the beer intentionally do a secondary souring, because you're constantly being exposed to mostly acetobacteria and lactobacteria. And once the yeast stop producing carbon dioxide, the oxygen is available and these bacteria can grow in the presence of the ethanol. That can be a bad thing. In fact, generally for the acetobacteria, that's a bad thing, producing acetic acid. This is not something you want in the distillate. It also attacks the copper in the still, produces copper salts, which are poisonous. But the lactobacteria can be desirable. And of course, lactobacteria are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, and they're a major part of our microbiome. And so we contaminate the stuff with it. And if left to grow, they're going to produce lactic acid and esters that can make more interesting congeners or aromatics in the final distillate. And we do that as a natural process. We don't even do it in a really controlled way. And it's amazing, again, to me, how well that works. I think the answer is we make these things historically because nature let it work. You know, it just worked for us. And these are the things that likely get in there. But there are other bacteria that if they start to show up, if you get them, you have a problem. So we're constantly cleaning up to make sure we're not giving opportunities for things to fester that will be problematic. So every fermentation, we do a clean of the fermentation. The still level is great because stills disinfect themselves. We don't have to worry about that. But we do have to occasionally clean them. One of the things is that because you produce lactic acid and esters, and also that you don't want in the spirit, but also when you do the distillation, you break down all the proteins in the yeast, for example. And when you do that, you're going to produce as a byproduct things like a hydrogen sulfide and an ammonia and disulfides and urea. And these are going to be in the vapor as well. And these can get into the spirit and give it a very terrible flavor and aroma. But one of the reasons we have copper in the still is it scrubs these elements out. But that means eventually you will passivate the copper with them. It gets black. And then to make the copper usable again, you have to clean and refresh the still, which we do with some detergent. And then we etch it with hot citric acid. And this makes it bright and shiny again. And we call this sweetening the still. This isn't figured out modern. This was figured out by the Scots hundreds of years ago. And it's amazing how well it works. And it's still done for the most part exactly the same way today in most distilleries. So you do have to worry about all these ways in which things can quote unquote spoil. And then sometimes you're actually, and actually I think one of the reasons why secondary souring is done, it's also done in the Jamaican rums. You actually let the dunder, the distillate, the waste that's left in we call it stillage, what's left in the pot. We save it, we let it rot for 2 to 4 weeks. And there are this specific bacteria that are preferred to grow in these environments. And traditionally they are intended to grow to give you certain flavor profiles. In fact, if you're familiar with like Japanese whiskeys and certain Japanese spirits, we tend to do straight yeast fermentations, but in much of Asia, they do combined yeast bacterial fermentations. And the idea is you have these competitive, strong growth of bacteria and yeast, which will give you your safe flavors and product. And the key is keeping things clean enough so that you don't get out-competed with off-taste or toxic microbiotic sources, right? That's your field, right? That's what it's all about. But we are not doing, this is not a sterile environment. In fact, there are even some things we live with in a distillery. There's a mold that specifically grows in the presence of very low level concentrations of ethanol in the air. And any place that you have distilleries, this black mold grows. You can't prevent it from growing. Go take a tour around the distilleries in Kentucky, and you'll find this mold growing on buildings and cars because there's so much alcohol in the air. So I think like everything else, we have to learn to live properly with these microbes to make things work. We can't completely control it.
Yeah, you never know. Maybe this black mold can deliver some kind of flavor or aroma to the finished product.
No, that stuff's not good. But it won't grow. It won't grow on the beers. It won't grow anywhere else. It can only grow in places where it's exposed to very low level atmospheric concentrations of ethanol. It's a one specific species. It's known as it exists, and we live with it. We just know it's there, and you clean it off occasionally, and it's just there. But it's a real pain for the people who live in Kentucky because it ruins their cars and the signs and the buildings. So
Very interesting. Great, thank you so much.
Alvin, did you want to ask your question? Maybe we'll give, maybe.
I
just
see it
let-
there.
Oh,
How much whiskey
Sure.
quality flavor profile is impacted by water and its minerals? That's a good question. And controversial. And some people will hear a lot about how water is important. Where that comes from originally has to do with the concept that is historically correct, that the bourbon distillers moved to Kentucky in part to use limestone spring water. Limestone spring water was valuable to them for a very specific reason. Most groundwater, surface water is exposed to minerals that have iron, and iron is a poison for yeast. Limestone spring water generally is free of iron. It's part of the chemistry of those sources. And so they used the limestone spring water because it didn't have iron in it and therefore didn't poison the yeast. By the way, that's also the reason why they sour mash. Sour mashing does not mean the secondary souring I was talking about before. Sour mashing exists because the other property of limestone spring water is that it is very alkaline. And as a result, it actually tends to also promote bacterial growth. To inhibit that, you simply have to neutralize it with acid. But if you're in the middle of the woods in Kentucky in the 19th century, the way you did that was you found the only available acid there in the woods, which was actually coming out of your still. It's the stillage, what was left over. That stuff is acidic. So the back set, we call it, the leftover stillage liquid, it's about pH 2. You would mix that back in with the water to neutralize it and and that's sour mashing. It gives you a different flavor profile. And we don't do that. We're sweet mashing. And sweet mashing is what's needed to do secondary souring. I know it's completely confusing. So that's where the concept that the water is very important comes from. Its most important effect is in the brewing. And when you go and later get the distillate and then add water back in when you go to bottle it, that water generally is either distilled or reverse osmosis, no matter what its source. Because if it has any significant minerals in it, it will usually cause the spirit to get cloudy by precipitation. Because remember, some of the congeners might be low molecular weight oligosaccharides and proteins and things. And these things that they bind up or chelate, they're going to end up dropping out of solution. It gets cloudy. So interestingly enough, you don't want to have added anything but very pure water when you go to bottle the product. And so I would argue that while the quality of the water is important, it's mostly important as part of the fermentation process, not because those are bringing specific flavors themselves. The traces aren't really important. Even the minerals are only important because they might help provide that for the growth of the yeast, which we can also add artificially. And then there's all those hobbyists and fanboys who are out there saying, no, it absolutely matters exactly what the water is. They don't know what they're talking about. Another thing that's sort of interesting is there's a lot of concern about terroir, which is very important for wine. Where you grow the grape, the exact conditions of whether it sees, even from slope to slope, completely changes the flavor profile of the wine that will be made from that grape. Vintage, everything, right? So this is not a strange question to ask. Does that matter for spirits? Well, if you're making the spirit from wine, I could see how it would matter, yes. But when you're making the spirit from grain, it's a little less clear. Different sources of grain make different flavor profile. That's clear. But we don't tend to see the difference being so much an issue of that hill versus that hill. We see it more a matter of it's this type of 6-row barley malt of this strain grown in this part of the country versus 2-row malt of that strain grown in that part of the country. So there are differences, but they're not as much. Or if maybe we can measure them, but everything else I'm describing makes a much bigger difference. And that's, I mean, even the temperature of fermentation, I change the temperature of fermentation by 2 degrees, the product is different. So maybe not so big a difference. I'm glad you enjoyed Prairie Sunshine.
Well, I really don't want to end this. I have to run to class. I know there's a couple students that also have to do the same. Really just so much appreciate you taking the time today and staying out, with us later today. And really would like to hit you up for a tour.
We look forward to it.
Anybody over 21 for a tasting.
Yeah, and also we'll try to follow up. One of the things we tried to do a few years back is we tried to do an iPro, which included distillation as part of the thing. The iPro program has been reorganized, and as a result, they don't work in the same way, and the funding issues are different, and it has to do with the roles the departments play is different. But if you think any of your the students in your school institute could be interested in it, we'd love to try to work with the institute to see if there's a way to try to bootstrap something like that as well, so that the students might have an opportunity to learn about not only the science but the whole business aspect and safety aspect of this.
Absolutely. Yeah, this industry is full of things that students are learning, right? And it's
Right.
applied in a different way. So it's really phenomenal. Yep. All
And
right.
drinking,
Well,
and drink in moderation. Okay.
and in moderation. Yes.
And of legal age.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so
Thanks for the
much.
invitation. Yeah.
Yes,
Have
thank you
fun.
again.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
All
all.
right. Have a good
Have a
one.
nice
Happy
weekend.
holidays.